Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I wish you a happy Tuesday. As per usual, we do have an interview for this Tuesday, and it is author Edgar Swamp, and his book is Amber Hollow. This is a book that actually got me to read horror. I read the whole thing. Really, a horror book, and I'm a wimp. I say this all the time on the podcast, and you know that I don't like, I've branched out with thrillers, and now, look at me reading horror. But it's more than just horror. It's also a mystery. It's also got some fantasy elements thrown in there. It is, historical fiction, because it does take place in the early 90s. I know that's not that far away, although for those of you who are born a little later than that, the technology is vastly different, so you might not be, you might be wondering what's up with the car phone and why don't they just call people on their cell phones? Well, that's part of the plot, actually. So again, as I said, the book is called Amber Hollow. On July 14th, 1991, an isolated village in northern Wisconsin is ground zero for an unprecedented fiery tragedy. Of the community's 600 residents, there are only 5 survivors. Detailed accounts by the victims contradict one another. The only link is a man named Anthony Guntram, who they allege is the primary suspect. Because he is presumably dead, this claim can't be verified. Only the villagers know the secret of Amber Hollow, a place where sanity is checked at the town line and the parameters of reality become blurred. An unconventional horror story by design, Edgar Swamp delivers an action-driven page-turner that will keep readers guessing until the calamitous ending. And that line, sanity is checked at the town line. That is actually on Edgar's website on the page for Amber Hollow. Excuse me, I'm having trouble getting sentences out. It says check your sanity at the town line. So you see that there is this mystery. There is something that needs to be investigated because a 600 member community suddenly only has 5 surviving members. There's obviously something going on here. The police are brought in, and we follow the 2 detectives as they try to figure out what is going on. But all the questions they ask only lead to more questions, and everything that they find leads to more questions. It gets weirder and weirder and creepier, and you start getting the horror elements, and I really liked I kept reading because I kept thinking, come on, I gotta find out what happens. And I'd think, okay, maybe I see where this is going. Yeah, I have some ideas. Wait, nope. It's not exactly where I thought that was going. He does a really great job of putting in twists and turns and keeping you interested and guessing a little bit. You might be the type of person that's able to figure out books better than I am, but I enjoy when I'm surprised by a book, when I read something and go, no way, I did not see that one coming. Maybe I should have. And then my mind goes back to all of the things previously up to that point where I'm like, okay, what were the clues? Where were the clues? And if I had more time, I would probably read this a second time to see if I can track that storyline through to the reveal. But unfortunately, as you know, my reading time is taken up by a lot of other things these days. But this book got me to read horror, and it got me to enjoy reading a horror novel. So Edgar Swamp can claim that, that it's not that title, that prize, I guess. There is no prize. I should make a prize. What would that prize look like? The this book got Sarah to read Horror Novel Prize. I'll have to think about that. Maybe make a certificate or something. I'm going to stop talking now. We are going to turn now to the interview with Edgar so he can talk to you about his book instead of me talking to you about making random certificates for people I've never actually met, just talked to on the phone. So let's turn now to that interview with Edgar Swamp about his new novel, Amber Hollow. Hi, Edgar. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Thank you for having me, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
I am very excited to talk to you about your new book, Amber Hollow. Before we get to the book, though, I would love for you to share a little bit about yourself so that my listeners can get to know you a bit.
Great. Well, I've always wanted to be a writer. In fact, the first thing I ever wrote was a play in second grade where I cast myself as Santa Claus and the girl I liked as Mrs. Claus. Suffice to say, it didn't go anywhere. Doors were not opened, but it's created a lifelong desire to write. And I've written in a number of different genres, influenced by dozens and dozens of different writers. But I found horror, sci-fi, dystopian kind of as a niche.
Mm-hmm. And yes, this book is definitely in that horror, fantasy, sci-fi kind of realm. I mean, it covers a bunch of genres. So, as I said, it's called Amber Hollow. Can you give a brief overview of the story?
Yes. A remote village in northern Wisconsin is the scene of a fiery tragedy in which, of the 600 residents, there are only 5 survivors. They're taken to Green Bay to 2 local hospitals where one is a psychiatric facility, the other one's a burn ward. And detectives are investigating the crime, and the survivors are all giving contradicting stories, but they're naming one person in particular who they allege is the primary suspect. However, he's amongst the dead, so the mystery lies within why are these people lying, who are they covering for, and how are they going to get testimony from a dead man.
Yeah, there's so many things I want to talk about, but I don't want to give stuff away because there's lots of twists and turns. But what was your inspiration for this particular story?
I really wanted to create what was an episode of mass hysteria. And initially I wanted there to be a plausible explanation for it. Ultimately, as I was writing it, I just couldn't find one. And so that's where the elements of fantasy and horror came into play. But the way I was writing it was kind of like I was kind of channeling the X-Files, where I wanted it to be 2 detectives. So that's where kind of the mystery genre comes in. I wanted it to be like a mystery being investigated, but with clues going nowhere. And so, hence, then it would have to gradually get creepier and creepier as the elements came into play to try to get closer and closer to the truth.
Right. And it does get weirder and creepier and more like I have no idea what is going on here.
And thank you. That was completely my goal. When I was doing my last drafts and edits, I tried to look at it as a person who was just reading it, and I was like, wow. And I never try to be self-congratulatory on anything. I'm a very, very humble man. But I feel like genuinely a reader is completely confused until they do get to the end where it's finally explained. And that was my goal. I mean, I truly hope that is what a reader is like, what is going on? And when they do find out, it was something that they didn't foresee. That was my hope anyway.
Right. Yeah, I had some suspicions going towards the end, but not to the extent of how it actually ended. So
cool.
Yeah.
I mean, because the idea is a lot of misdirection. You know, trying to get you to think it's one thing, you know, and then trying to get you to think it's another thing. That throughout it's just peppered with misdirection.
Right.
So
Right.
somebody could go, oh, I know exactly where this is going. Then no, what?
Right.
Because I have always loved books like that that
Mhm.
just keep you guessing, where you literally at the end you're like, dang. I mean, like a favorite movie of mine was The Sixth Sense,
Oh, huh.
and I know that everybody's seen it, but for the few people who haven't, I won't wreck the ending. But you've seen it, obviously.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I mean, did you see that coming?
No, not at the time. But it's been so long now. I feel like I should have. Because, it's pretty much, um, I do know people who said they saw it coming, but I did not. So I was too busy being
didn't either.
freaked out by everything else.
Right. That was a good one. So yeah,
Yes.
I was just hoping that it would be enough misdirection that in the end, because actually somebody did tell me, oh, I thought it was this specific character, and then it wasn't, and I was like, oh,
Right.
okay, I did my job then.
Yeah, and I actually had stopped reading, to put the book down one night to go to sleep, and then the next day I picked it up, and it was kind of that big reveal that we can't talk about, and I was like, wait, what?
Cool.
Yeah.
I mean,
So,
I truly hope, because, I mean, seriously, I mentioned Sixth Sense because I saw that movie and the movie Fight Club in the same year in the movie theater. It seemed like it was a year where those movies were very popular, and both of them completely got me. Where I'm like, what? I literally never saw those endings coming, and I always wanted to write a book like that. And this is my fourth self-published novel, and my previous efforts, I did try to do it on my second novel, but apparently that I won't say fell flat. I liked it, but there were people that didn't. So, and ultimately, it's up to the reader.
right.
It doesn't matter what I think. If the reader didn't get it, then I failed.
So let's talk a little bit about the two detectives who are working the case, Sadie and Jeremy. What about them do you think will resonate with readers?
Well, I made a conscious decision to make Sadie African American because the time that this story takes place, I'm actually from Green Bay, the city that the story takes place in, and they work for a police department that my dad worked for. So I was able to lend authenticity to the story by getting my dad explaining the hierarchy, how it works in that station. And I'd been there. Don't take that the wrong way.
I assume you just visited with your dad.
Yes. Take your son to work day. And I deliberately cast her as African American because in the 70s and the 90s, when I grew up in Green Bay, it was predominantly a Caucasian community, and there actually weren't very many women who were police officers. There were secretaries, there was women who mostly worked the 911 call centers, but there were no female detectives, and they weren't African American. And the reason I cast her as that is I do like to lend racial diversity to all of my novels because I'd like to appeal to a wider audience. But I also did that because I thought, wow, she would have to be really tough, to overcome, first of all, being a woman in an all-male environment and African American in a predominantly Caucasian community. And so what I thought that would do is that would just show how tough that this woman is, how smart she is, that she could overcome those seeming disabilities. So that, and then when crunch time comes down, I mean, she's our tough as nails character who can process this stuff. The events do get horrific, so anybody in some capacity would be freaked out. But she has a greater capacity to handle it with those handicaps, I believe. and that was my idea.
Okay.
And Jeremy, I cast as just a real friendly. I actually made them not very atypical of what you would expect. I didn't cast these as super handsome and beautiful people. Jeremy admittedly is kind of rough looking, bad haircut, blunt features. I just didn't want to be stereotypical in, this because, and this is for Green Bay too. I mean, that was the realism, that this is a small Midwestern town. They're not going to look like Mulder and Scully,
Right.
They're not going to be this beautiful couple. I made them average Joes. And Joettes. I just wanted them to be just average people, but who were very skilled detectives placed in a very, very outlandish situation. And I just through their dialogue, I really wanted to create characters. I've been not accused. I suppose whatever word fits. Prior novels of mine, people have said, I don't like your characters. And I've written novels where you're kind of not supposed to. I've read a lot of books by authors like Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote Fight Club, and Bret Easton Ellis, who wrote American Psycho. And these are writers that I just loved, who didn't care if you liked their characters. In fact, they were creating characters you were not supposed to like. And so earlier novels of mine, I was kind of influenced by that. But in trying to get an audience, it's really hard. You kind of have to give people something they can hang their hat on. And so I deliberately set about to make these two really likable so that you can root for them, so that you care what happens to them.
Mm-hmm.
So that was very important to me with both these two, is that friendly banter, hopefully, that's, kind of witty, keeps the story moving, and you sense this camaraderie and this caring between them, so that if in a situation of peril, you feel for them. You're like, oh no, instead
right.
of, oh, I hate these people anyway, just kill them.
Oh, yeah, that's never a fun experience in a book. There's got to be something that you relate to, or even if it's not relatable, there's something compelling about a character. So
yes, and I really wanted to strive to do that.
Oh my goodness, I'm jumping in here to say, have you ever read one of those books where you don't like anyone? Nobody makes you want to root for them. Those books are so frustrating, for me at least, to get through. I have to be able to connect with someone on some kind of level. I have to find them compelling in some way. Even if I don't like them, there has to be something about them that makes me want to keep reading the book and find out what happens to them. So that's just my 2 cents. We are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about the historical setting of the book. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I'm speaking today with Edgar Swamp about his new novel, Amber Hollow. Before the break, we were talking about the two main characters, and now we are moving on to the setting of the book and how that plays a role in how the story unfolds. So let's go ahead and get back to that interview. You've mentioned that the book is set in the early 90s. So part of that so that Sadie would have that opposition, and what were the other reasons for setting it in that time frame?
Originally set this to be in 2018, and a brother-in-law of mine that does my proofreading, and he got it back to me, and he said that in our day and age of the World Wide Web, Instagram, Homeland Security, all the above, dark technology, was like, this could not happen. The only way it could happen, it couldn't happen in the United States. It would have to be like remote Siberia to be as off the grid as it needed to be. And so I essentially was like, so if I get rid of the web, and he was like, yeah, then it would work. So I basically looked up when the World Wide Web was launched, and I literally made this story happen a month before that. So I picked it so it could be at the peak of our technology, as close as it could be technology-wise, but I also lucked out that incidences occurred in that same year that I could incorporate. It coincidentally allowed me to incorporate characters that I otherwise couldn't have. And so it really was cool.
Had you decided previously that the incidents around the arrest of
No, yeah,
Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
No, I was just, is it Jeffrey Dahmer? I just completely blanked on the right serial killer.
Yep, no, that's the one. Yep.
Okay, so I had been meaning to ask if you'd put that in there, but it just turned out that it worked time-wise because of your choosing that month before the web launched. So that's pretty cool.
And I got really lucky because the story, and this isn't a spoiler, it centers around Bastille Days, and which is in Wisconsin. It's a huge thing because Wisconsin, at least Green Bay, northern Wisconsin, was largely populated by French missionaries back when it was settled in the 1600s. So because of that, that's a celebration that happens every year. And I used that as a centerpiece, and that's on July 14th. And the arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer, very fortuitously, was on July 22nd or 23rd. And so I was completely able to put that into my timeline by choosing that year. And again, it was a culmination of just luck, really. Just picking, the World Wide Web, it was launched in August of 91, but then I saw, and he was arrested then, and Bastille Days is there. It was a harmonic convergence of really cool things that that I was fortunate that then led some kind of more credence to the story, and then I was able to more elaborate on. So sometimes you get lucky.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges or not challenges? What are some of the interesting things about writing kind of a multi-genre book? Because this book contains horror, it contains fantasy, it contains mystery. What is that process like for you?
Well, I set out to have it be like a Twilight Zone episode. And so Twilight Zone episodes were always mysteries. I watched them as a kid, and I was always trying to guess the ending. And so, but they were horrific or they were science fiction. And so that's where the mystery element came in. And then I realized I was going to be centering it around an event that was going to be investigated by detectives. Once I figured out I had no plausible explanation in the real world, I was like, well, it's going to have to be a horror novel because I could not explain it. And then actually, interestingly enough, the fantasy parts came out of nowhere. I was looking for a hook. I was looking for some way to establish the creepiness of this village. And it just was one Saturday afternoon where I had a whole day where I could work on it, and I came up with a scene that I was like, wow, oh my God, is that cool? And then from then, that shaped the fantasy elements of it. It was completely by chance. it was one of those, I have no idea how I'm going to do this. And I just woke up on the right side of the bed one day, and it happened, and the scene came out, and I just loved it so much that I knew I could continue to use that throughout the book to develop the plot and to further the characters and the mystery. So fantasy was not an intention at all. It was really, it was more going to be a mystery horror, but very, very fortunately, sometimes our imaginations just can really rock us a solid,
Mm-hmm.
and give us something we didn't foresee was going to happen.
Yeah. So with the time frame and some of the historical aspects of it, what kind of research did you do for the book?
Well, I had to research the area where I wanted to put the town, and then like I said, I had originally written the first draft in 2018 with our technology. So taking it back to 91, I had to take all our modern technology and get rid of it, and then just research what communications technology was at the time. And I'm old enough that I lived during that time, and I remember the trim line phone on the wall with the cord stretched 50 feet so I could be behind the garage talking to my girlfriend or my dirtbag buddies, and no one else in my family could hear me, And I mean, I personally remembered it, but I didn't know in the event of, the police station. My father had a pager he had to carry, so anywhere he was, he could be paged, so he had to go into work. That it was pagers, it was CBs, it was landlines, and car phones. But back when car phones took up like your whole trunk. And so that and computers, because they were computers back then. They were mostly Mac classics. They were the earliest versions, and they were giant. And so I had to convert everything to that. And fortunately, because I wrote a previous novel called Blackout that relied on cell phones to keep the plot moving. That's how my characters found out everything. Their phone rang. What? Oh my God, I'll be right there. Fortunately, this story didn't require that. It wasn't hinged in the technology we have today. So
right. In fact, it works better, I think, without the technology, because there's certain aspects that you can't. There's one detective who goes to investigate part of this, or a police officer, and he can't just send a text or call a cell phone.
Yep. Where in fact, and there's no GPS satellite, so they can't trace his phone. I don't know how old you are. I won't ask. I will make you share that with your listeners. But I remember that. I, in fact, one time drove across country from Wisconsin to California in a old Oldsmobile. No, before cell phones existed, I just couldn't afford one. And just how off the grid you are. And I used a map, I mean, that back in the day, we actually used maps. You used pay phones. I would buy calling cards.
Calling cards, yeah.
I mean, it really brought me back, and so I referenced the music of the time that people would have listened to, and unfortunately it was pre-grunge. I really love grunge because that's my era, but my story takes place literally 2 months before Nirvana dropped the album Nevermind. So
right, but at least it takes place in. At least it takes place in Wisconsin, so you can. Although it's summer, but at least you can still have flannel. You can still.
Oh, totally. Yeah, still got. In fact, flannel's a constant everywhere. In fact, what's kind of funny is when grunge hit, I was like, they're wearing what I'm wearing.
Right.
I don't even have to change my clothes.
Yeah, I grew up in Montana, so I had the same. What? Everyone wears flannel. What are you talking about?
Right. It was nothing new to you. It was something to keep you warm.
Yep, flannel and hiking boots, always a good combination.
That's what I was wearing too. with a Levi's jean jacket. Which,
oh yeah.
At the time, that was what was considered, and no offense to you, I don't mean you, but in my little town of Deep here, that was dirt bag attire.
Nice.
You had you had the flannel, you had the jean jacket, a pair of hiking boots. Yep.
Okay, I'm sorry. Jumping in here again so we can take our second break of the podcast, but maybe it's wrong to laugh at my own interview, but every time I hear that part, it just makes me giggle. Yep. Oh, Flannel, how I love you. We are going to, as I said, take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about some of Edgar's other novels. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with Edgar Swamp. We have been talking about his book Amber Hollow with mention of a few of his other novels, and now we're going to talk some more about those other novels.
You have mentioned a couple of your other books, but are there any of those books that you would like to highlight in this interview or talk about at all?
I sure do. In fact, I've been being asked what my next project is going to be. And my very first novel, by anybody who read my books, is they cited as a favorite of theirs, but that it was too long. The characters, a lot of them weren't very likable, but they liked the story. It's called The Geyer Mission, and it's something I self-published in 2012. And I made every single mistake a first-time self-published writer could make on it. I didn't have it professionally edited. I got stupidly thinking I could do it myself. It was way too long. And it was like I launched with The Grapes of Wrath when it should have been Of Mice and Men. You know what I mean? It should have been 200 pages, and I launched with this 800-page monstrosity. So it was a really hard sell for the publicity people. And to their credit, they did the best they could with a book that had typos even on the cover and an author photo that made me look like an axe murderer. It was not intentional.
If it was horror, that's appropriate.
Well, I thought it was at the time. But apparently, so honestly, I mentioned that book because it would be most closely related to Amber Hollow, genre-wise, that if Amber Hollow resonated with readers, if they really liked it, I could see that as a follow-up once I rewrite, edit the heck out of it, and in the ending, I have 3 sisters, and one of them is champions my cause more than the rest. And she read it. She was like, couldn't you have at least had one person live?
Oh, dear.
I was like, you mean everybody dying? That's not good. She's like, there's got to be one person. So I would make more likable characters. I would shorten the heck out of it. And I guess I could have 1 or 2 people live at the end. but I think anybody who enjoyed Amber Hollow would enjoy it because it's a horror novel, but it's an adventure. It's kind of an adventure horror novel, and that it will move a lot better once I cut out the riffraff. It was bogged down in tons of backstories, and with Amber Hollow, I wanted to streamline this bad boy. It seemed that the biggest critique I received on all my books is I could have told that same story in half the pages. So I'm trying to slim these down.
You mentioned writing that play in second grade that did not get you a girlfriend, but that's okay.
Yeah, I'm so bummed.
So when did you start writing to try to publish?
I actually was sidelined by music. I started playing guitar and singing, and I mentioned grunge because that came along, and it was what my bands were playing. We were playing that style of music. We were dressed in those kind of clothes, and so I thought I'm going to be a rock star, and not knowing that, boy, it's a lot more to it than just wanting to be. And I had been writing. Writing was actually my first love from childhood through my teens and on. But when I discovered music, it just derailed my writing. And so after I failed, I went to Austin, Texas, which I think is a great place for any aspiring musician. If you think you're good enough, go to Austin. You'll either find out you are or you'll find out you're not. And it was extremely humbling to me. And I was like, I'm going to start writing again. And so at the age of 30, I seriously began writing again. And if your listeners are interested as far as tenacity is concerned in pursuing something you love and knowing that it might take a while, I realized when I started writing again at the age of 30, my chops were gone. I mean, anything I had earned up to that point doing music and disregarding writing for 10 years, I still had a great imagination, but my chops were gone. So it took me 10 years just to become a decent writer again. And then at the age of 40-ish is when I discovered self-publishing, where it wasn't vanity publishing anymore. It was print on demand. And it seemed like something feasible. It was affordable. And so from the age of 30 through actually about the age of 45, I just hit it hard, made myself do word counts every day, made sure I did it as much as possible. I had to practice just to get back up to speed. And I even look at the novels I've written from the one I told you about through two others up to Amber Hollow, and I still don't feel like I hit my stride. I feel I can always do better. So practice. But it is something I always wanted to do. I just got sidelined. And I sometimes wondered if music didn't get in the way, if I would have had something that would have hit prior to this. But, you never know where life's going to take you. So
That's right. We had a bit of a conversation before we actually spoke on the phone, and you write under a pseudonym. So could you talk a little bit about how you chose the pseudonym?
I've got a great story in regards to that. At the age of 30, when I realized I could no longer do bands, sleeping in cars, and so on, I had to get a real job. And I got really lucky. I ended up in the veterinary field. And I got hired to work in a kennel, but I was at a clinic where they needed veterinary technicians. And this is prior to it requiring an associate's degree. So I was trained on the job. And a dog came into the clinic that was named Edgar Swamp. And I was like, that is hilarious. And he was the sweetest dog. And he came for years and years and years. He was older. He eventually succumbed to age and he passed. And all the people I worked with they knew how much I liked him, and they gave me his collar. The owner didn't want it. I was surprised. And, so I'm like, aw. And actually, showing my rock and roll roots, I wore the collar for a while. Until it actually gave me a rash.
Oh, geez. That's not good.
But I always liked the name, and I was like, that would be such a cool writing name. And I was writing under my real name. My real name is Brian Martin. And it's so generic. If you go, just look in your community and type Brian Martin, there's at least 300. Where I live, there's like 1,000 Brian Martins in this area alone. And I was submitting horror and sci-fi stories to online magazines, and on a whim, I decided to use Edgar Swamp. And the editor got back to me with some suggestions about the story, how to change the ending. He liked it, but if you could change the ending. And then he said, "And is Edgar Swamp, is that your name?" And I was like, "Well, no." He goes, "That sounds good. Use that." And I was like, all right. And so I started using it, and I have people make fun of me, but I looked up the name. It's a real name. I mean, there's really people out there with the last name Swamp. So, yeah, I mean, it's not just like that show on cable, Swamp People, I even looked in this area where I live. I live in north of San Diego, by about 35 miles up in the burbs. And there's actually some people in this area that's last name is Swamp. So it's a real name.
It's a real name. I actually told my mom, I said, I'm doing an interview this weekend with a guy who writes horror, and his name is Edgar Swamp. And I said, it's either a pseudonym or it's the perfect last name he had to write. He had to write horror.
Yeah. When I met that dog, it was a special bond, and I didn't know, that I was going to lift the name from him, but he gave me his permission. As best as I could tell. He just licked my face, and I took that as a yes.
So when you take the time to read, do you have favorite authors or genres? Do you like to read in the horror genre?
It's funny because I really loved it as a kid. And this is where, from other interviews, that's where I wanted to kind of, I name dropped the horror writers that were very influential. But then as a teenager, I kind of got snobby, and I went off in the Steinbeck, Kurt Vonnegut, Jack London. I really dove into the classics, Ernest Hemingway, that kind of thing, and kind of eschewed horror writing as, they're a bunch of hacks, as I was in my teens. And that's why I kind of mentioned earlier Chuck Palahniuk and Bret Easton Ellis, because they really pulled me back into the horror genre that I had kind of left. My stories, though, I was writing, even when I was doing music, I would occasionally be writing stories. And if they weren't autobiographical, they were always of a strange bent. And I don't know if you're familiar with Palahniuk or Ellis, but Ellis wrote American Psycho, which resonated really heavily with me. It was really one of the most horrific pieces of fiction I've ever read. And are you familiar by any chance?
I'm familiar. I have not read them. And actually, one of the authors that I spoke with in a previous interview, Greg Levine, referenced Chuck. Is it Palahniuk? I can never remember how to pronounce his last name. But
Palahniuk. Yes.
Yeah. So I have not read those. I'm not a huge fan of horror. I tend I tend to steer clear because I'm a wimp. But so I'm branching out with the podcast.
Okay, well, that's cool. So thank you for talking to me.
Sure.
In regard, Palahniuk is just a brilliant satirist, and the equivalent to me of a modern-day Kurt Vonnegut. If you were ever a fan of any of his works, maybe Slaughterhouse-Five, I know, is recommended reading for high school, I believe. And Palahniuk is most known for his book Fight Club, which was not a horror novel. It was really satire.
Right.
But he actually then wrote some horror novels. And they were very satirical, but they were really dark. And I was like, wow, he is doing something with the genre that brought it made it exciting to me again. And when asked in interviews, he said, yep, I did a horror series, then I did a sci-fi series, a time-traveling series. He wrote a couple of books about a girl who died and went to hell, and it was her adventures in the afterlife. One was called Doomed, and the other one was called Damned. And so ultimately, he's very much a satirist. He's a comedian, but he did delve into some really dark stuff, which got me, as a writer, I've always found that I fit easier in with my ideas writing the scary stuff. And so it got me to revisit writers I'd enjoyed as a child, I should say as a teenager. And I over-referenced Stephen King in a past interview, so I don't want to beat that to death. But the major influence there. But then as an adult, discovering these other writers that were more contemporary, but were dealing with these themes that were very horrific. And I'm trying to think of any other like modern horror writers, because I wasn't a Dean Koontz fan. That kind of sailed by me. And I don't like I loved slasher films as a kid. They bore the crap out of me now. I like psychological. And Chuck was in the psychological realm. Like, is this really happening, or is this something that's a product of somebody's imagination? I really like that kind of element of horror. But I also like the blood and guts. If it's done appropriately, if it's done in a way, well, it's hard to say tasteful.
Right.
But how do you tastefully disembowel somebody?
Yeah, right. That's the kind of horror that I don't like. Right.
And Amber Hollow doesn't offer up a lot of that. My previous novels actually were pretty gory. They were more niche market because, like I said, unlikable characters. They contained. It wouldn't be anything you'd recommend for anybody under the age of 18. And with Amber Hollow, I set out to write more of an all ages, all audience. Like if it would be like a PG-13, where my other ones were like hard R, if not borderline unrated.
Well, I'm grateful that I met you for this book and not one of your previous ones.
Yeah, that's why I would tone down a lot of stuff in the Geyer Mission and try to make it more of a character-driven piece if it would be a follow-up to Amber Hollow. Because it's you write and you want people to read, but if you're scaring most people off simply because the subject matter it isn't resonating with them, what's the point? Mm-hmm. So I really, really did. And I did want to put social themes in there that people could relate to, but not have an agenda, not burden it with my own, take on politics, or I try to never deal with religion, I just try to keep it character-driven, story-driven, and keep the pace moving.
One last interruption for one last commercial break, and when we come back, we'll be wrapping up this episode. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with Edgar Swamp about his novels, most recently his novel Amber Hollow. Let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
I know you have a website, so if you can tell people where to find your website and if you are active on any social media.
I am. In fact, I have to work on it more this weekend, but I'm on my Amazon page. I've got to figure out how to, that one is so unuser friendly, it feels like. But I'm active on Goodreads. I post videos of me playing and singing because it allows me to post videos. I've got a joke trailer I made for Amber Hollow. There really is no movie, but I've got a trailer for it that I just made through some app on my phone. And I have a blog that's on there, and that's Edgar Swamp on Goodreads. I have a website, www.edgarswamp.com, which unfortunately I am not the administrator. And so what I'm doing is as I collect a bunch of links, that's when I submit them to the guy who is. And like when I get a link for this, definitely going to get this on there. And a couple of the other podcasts I've done. But it does link and reference all my other books. Anything that's coming up, I try to get listed on there. And it has reviews on there. Actually, there's a couple of reviews for Amber Hollow on some pre-reviews. And let's see, I also Goodreads, Amazon, my website. Yeah, that's where my biggest online presence is right now. And it's a beautiful website, but it's not interactive. But it's, it's interactive. You can order books off of there. And you can see reviews on there, and you can contact me through there. But it's not like I've seen like authors where, they've got video games and all kinds of interesting stuff. Mine's not that high tech, but it does have all the pertinent information one would need.
Right.
So to find me or to find my books, and right now my books are for sale. They can be ordered from me through my website or Amazon, and the Kindle book I'm selling at 99 cents just to get it out there, just to sell it as cheap as possible. The paperback is $11.99. I priced it as cheap as Amazon would let me do it, and I think it's a good deal because the art on the book is beautiful. And it's actually the Kindle is a little less frills, it's all there. It's the same thing. But so I've got it really priced to move for anybody. Oh, and if you have Amazon Prime, it's free. So you can read it for free, or you can borrow it from another lender. Because right now my goal is to give away as many as I can, because I just am really wanting reader reviews that would hopefully increase my Amazon ranking, which would hopefully, my goal with this ultimately is to take it from self-published and hopefully find a small publishing house that may be interested and take a chance on me. So that it could lead to bigger things is what I really like.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And we've talked about numerous topics today. It's been fun, but is there anything that we haven't touched on that you wanted to mention at this point?
Life experience. In fact,
Yes.
and I'm not going to go off on a bunch of stories, but I just, if any of your listeners are aspiring writers, I just have this bit of advice. I wanted to write when I was a kid. I didn't know what to write about because I had no life experience. And you'd be amazed. Just if you have nothing, just go out, live your life for 10 years. Hopefully it's exciting, and you'll find that the more life experience that you do accumulate, the easier it really is to write books, because you'll suddenly, oh yeah, this weirdo I met at a gas station in Raleigh, North Carolina, that person would be perfect here, like as much things as you can do in your life. I was a student in Milwaukee at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and I regrettably dropped out to pursue my musical ambitions. And I regret dropping out because a degree really would have really helped versus not. But the life experience I gained opting Plan B has fueled a lot of my writing through all the weirdos I've met, the weird situations I've been in. So I can't emphasize enough that if you're a writer and you love writing and you're just looking at a blank page, go out and live a little, I mean, be careful.
Mm-hmm.
Do it in a controlled environment or however. But I found that for me, it's shaped a ton of my books. I've met people who become characters or composite characters. And so that is one thing that has really, really helped me. And an idea for a book can come from anywhere. A headline from a newspaper, your neighbors that seem to be going through some strange situation, anything. You can source it from anywhere. It's really just the desire to have fun with writing. I literally do this. It's because I am compelled. I have to. And that's why I've stuck with it as long as I have. I am not a professional yet. I have yet to get a check for more than $150 for anything I've written. And trust me, as a self-published writer, you'll spend a lot more than that, mostly on publicity. Mm-hmm. So you really got to love doing it, So right. I don't know. That's why I am. It's just something that is a passion for me. That I try not to consider that it's a vanity thing. That it's a product I'm hoping to become a brand at some point. Sure. So you being so kind as having me on your podcast can help me.
Yeah.
Your listeners can go, God, that guy sounds like a weirdo. His book might be great.
I love weirdos. Yeah, see, you're... well, I have very much enjoyed speaking with you, and I can honestly say that I enjoyed a horror novel. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I mean, thanks. I really appreciate that.
So thank you again to Edgar for joining me to talk about horror novels, which I normally wouldn't talk about. But hey, I enjoyed talking to Edgar and I enjoyed reading this book. So that right there is pretty impressive, at least to me. Thank you so much, as always, to you, our listeners, my listeners. I so very much appreciate you and your tuning in to share my love of books. If you are a fan of this podcast, I'm going to give my normal little spiel. Please do subscribe, like us on social media, follow us on social media, share, retweet, do all of those wonderful social media things. And if you would be so kind as to give us a review, that would also be lovely. A nice review would be very helpful. Edgar mentioned that Amazon reviews really help authors in their books, and podcast reviews also help us in the podcast world. So especially iTunes reviews. Would love it if you could drop us I'm just going to say it. I'd love it if you could drop us a 5-star review. What is it? If you don't put it out there, then you'll never know unless you ask. So thank you so much for joining me. Join me again on Friday, and we'll talk about books. In the meantime, I hope you are having a wonderful week and that you find plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast. part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.